The basin water had gone cold an hour ago, and still Mira knelt beside it, wringing the same cloth between her hands until her knuckles ached. Steam no longer rose. The Alpha King's chamber held its breath around her. Fire banked low. Sheets turned down by someone else's hands. The whole room smelling of cedar smoke and leather and him, though he wasn't there. She liked it better when he wasn't there. She could breathe at her own pace, move at her own rhythm, let her shoulders drop from where they lived now, somewhere up near her ears. She hummed without meaning to. Just 3 notes. A scrap of a lullaby her mother used to press into her hair on nights when the harvest failed, and fear lived in the house like a second family. 3 notes, barely more than breath, and she didn't even hear herself do it until the door behind her opened on silent hinges, and a voice like gravel dragged through velvet said, "Say that again." Mira's whole body went still, as creek water before the frost takes it. She had not spoken in 4 years, not one word, not when the trader's whip found her sister's back instead of her own, not when the household master inspected her teeth in her hands and pronounced her defective, but serviceable to a guard captain who hadn't cared whether the merchandise could talk. Not once, in 4 years of scrubbing floors in the king's wing of Vathorn Palace, had a single syllable left her throat on purpose. She had let them believe she couldn't. It was the only door she'd found that the wolves of this palace didn't think to guard. Now the Alpha King of Vathorn stood in his own doorway with his shirt open at the collar, and his amber eyes narrowed on her like she was a deer he'd scented half a mile out, and the silence that had kept her alive for 4 years cracked straight down the middle. She kept her head down, heart slamming. "Don't move, don't move." He didn't hear words. He heard a hum. Hums aren't speech. Mutes can hum. The lie steadied her like a hand on the small of her back, and she rose, set the cloth on the basin's edge, and reached for the bucket. Ordinary. Ordinary. Just a servant finishing her work. Mira. She froze. He knew her name. Of course he knew her name. He was the king, and this was his house, and every soul in it answered to him eventually. But he'd never said it before. Not once in the 8 months she'd worked this wing. He said names like he was testing the weight of them in his mouth, deciding if they deserved to stay there. He crossed the room. Not fast. Wolves rarely needed to be fast to be frightening. And stopped close enough that she caught the change in his scent before she dared lift her eyes. Cedar smoke gone sharp with something else now. Something curious and faintly hungry. The scent a wolf wore when he'd caught a trail he hadn't expected and didn't intend to lose. "You hummed," he said. She shook her head. Small. Apologetic. The universal gesture of, "I am sorry. I do not understand. I am only a servant," that she'd practiced in mirrors of dark windows until it became true. His jaw worked once, a small muscle ticking at the hinge of it, and his gaze dropped, not unkindly, but thoroughly, to her throat, as if he could see straight through skin to the voice she'd buried there. "Get out," he said, finally, and his voice had gone rough in a different way now, rough like he was angry at himself for something. "Send Halvet up with fresh water." Mira didn't wait to be told twice. She gathered the basin and the cold cloth and walked. Didn't run, never run. Running tells them you have something to run from. Out of the king's chamber and down 3 flights of servants' stairs that smelled of tallow candles and damp stone. And only when she reached the laundry alcove, alone, did she let her knees buckle and her back find the wall. "He heard you." She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum, where her heart still hammered loud enough that surely the whole palace could hear it the way she'd heard nothing at all for 4 years. "He heard you, and he didn't believe the lie." The king's name was Rowan Vathorn, though no one in the palace had called him simply Rowan, since his coronation 11 years ago, and even fewer had dared it before, when his father still drew breath and ruled with a hand that left scars that didn't fade just because the man who'd given them eventually died. He sat now in the chair by his cold fire with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, the posture of a man pretending to think about something simple when the thing eating at him was not simple at all. She hummed. 3 notes. He'd been 3 rooms away, restless, sleepless the way he'd been sleepless every night for 11 years because a king's mind never fully shut its eyes, and something had moved through the stone like a hand laid flat against his chest. He'd followed it before his own good sense caught up to his feet. He knew the mute girl, knew her the way he knew the 3rd stair that creaked, the way he knew which window in the East Hall let in the worst draft. A fixture, a fact of the house, noted, and then forgotten. Small, quick-handed. Eyes the brown gold of steeped tea, always lowered. She moved through his rooms like she was trying to leave no scent behind at all, which should have told him something, because nothing alive left no scent. He'd simply never had reason to ask what she was hiding it from. Now, he had reason. He dragged a hand down his face. 3 notes shouldn't undo a man. He'd faced down rival packs at the border with less unsteadiness in his chest than he felt right now, replaying a sound smaller than a sparrow's call. You're imagining a voice into a girl who has none. You're tired. You're lonely in a way you don't let yourself name. And your wolf is hunting ghosts because there's nothing else worth hunting in this house. He almost believed himself. Almost. Except that wolves didn't imagine scent shifts, and hers had changed the second she heard her own name in his mouth. Fear, yes. Sharp and familiar. The fear every servant in this palace carried for him whether he wanted them to or not. But under it, under the fear, something he hadn't smelled on her before. Something that smelled like a held breath, like a door braced shut from the other side. He thought, I will find out what's behind that door. He told himself it was simple curiosity, a king's right to know every secret kept under his own roof. He did not let himself examine, not yet, why his hands had gone unsteady at the sound of 3 small notes, or why some buried, wordless part of him, the part that didn't speak in court Latin or council decrees, the part that was pure wolf and pure instinct, had gone taut as a bowstring and whispered, low and certain as a struck bell. That's her. That's the one. The household master's name was Pel Ardo, and the detail every servant in Vaythorn Palace learned about him within their first week was this. He counted everything twice. Coins twice. Linens twice. The number of servants present at morning roll call. Twice. His lips moving silently through the tally even when the number never changed. It wasn't suspicion exactly. It was a man who had once miscounted something that mattered and never forgiven himself the gap. He found Mira in the laundry alcove an hour after she'd fled the king's chamber, her color still high, her hands not quite steady on the folding of a sheet that didn't need folding twice. You were upstairs a long while, Pel said. Not a question. He didn't ask questions of servants. He made statements and watched their faces answer for them. Mira nodded, kept folding. His Majesty say anything to you? She shook her head, the lie so practiced now it barely cost her anything, a coin spent so many times the metal had gone smooth. And Pel studied her for a beat longer than comfortable, his eyes narrowing the way they did when a count came up wrong. Strange man lately, he said, mostly to himself, moving on down the row of baskets. Hasn't slept right in years, if the night staff are honest, pacing his rooms like a caged thing. A pause. You'd know. Working those halls. She kept her head down and her hands busy and did not say, Yes, I know. I have heard him pace through these walls 100 nights, and wondered what kept a king, who had everything, who owned the very air she breathed, awake. Pell had bought her 4 years ago from a trader's caravan 2 kingdoms south, in a transaction so plain it might have been for livestock. A sum of coin, a signature. A girl handed over with her wrists still raw from rope. He hadn't asked why she didn't speak. He'd only asked, flatly, practically, can she still work? And when the trader said yes, Pell had counted out the coin twice and called it a fair trade. He wasn't cruel to her. That was the strange mercy of it, the thing that made the silence bearable instead of unbearable. Pell Ardo ran his household the way he counted his linens, with a flat, indifferent fairness that asked nothing of her except competence. He'd never once tried to make her speak, had, in fact, once cuffed a younger servant boy across the ear for mocking her silence. Not out of kindness exactly, but because mockery makes for sloppy work, and I won't have sloppiness under this roof. She owed him nothing, and yet some nights, scrubbing floors long after the rest of the household slept, she found herself grateful that the man who held the paper proving he owned her had never once tried to own the only thing she had left: her voice, her choice of when, and to whom, and if. That choice had nearly broken tonight, cracked open by 3 notes and a king's gravel voice saying, "Say that again," like a command he expected obeyed. She folded the sheet a 3rd time, though it needed only 1, and told herself the unsteadiness in her hands was only cold. For 9 nights after, the king did not summon her. Mira told herself this was relief. She told herself this while scrubbing the East Hall floors at dawn, while carrying water up the servants' stair with her shoulders set hard against the ache of it, while lying awake in the narrow cot she shared a room with 2 other girls, and listening to their breathing even out into sleep, while her own mind paced the same small circle. He knows. He didn't say anything. He knows, and he's deciding what to do about it. On the 10th night, she heard him pacing again. She lay still in the dark, listening through the stone the way she'd learned to over 4 years. Every wall in this old palace carried sound differently. Some swallowed it. Some let it through like gossip. And the wall behind the king's chamber she'd discovered by accident months ago carried everything. Footsteps, the scrape of a chair, once, months back, something that might have been weeping, though she'd never let herself name it that, because kings didn't weep, not kings like this one, hard-jawed and golden-eyed and built like a wall himself. Tonight the pacing stopped, started again, stopped, and then, very low, half to himself, half to the empty room. Sing again. She didn't. She lay frozen, one hand pressed flat over her own mouth as though the words might escape through her palm if she didn't damn them there, and didn't sing, and didn't move, until the pacing resumed on the other side of the wall and went on for another hour before it finally stopped. She thought, "He's listening for me." She thought, "I have to be more careful." She did not think, not yet, not for several more days, the thought that would eventually undo her. What if I want him to find me? The accident, when it came, wasn't an accident at all, not really. Pell Ardo had simply miscounted, or rather, hadn't miscounted, because Pell never miscounted, but had recounted and found one too few hands assigned to the king's private library on the night a council of border lords was due to dine 3 floors below. And so it was Mira who was sent up alone, at dusk, to restock the oil lamps and bank the hearth before His Majesty retired to read, as he always did, after such dinners, too wound tight from politics to sleep. She didn't expect him there already. He sat in the window seat with a glass of something amber untouched at his elbow, still in his council clothes, dark wool open at the throat, and the whole room smelled of him before she even crossed the threshold. Cedar and leather and tonight. Something sharper underneath. Frustration gone sour. The scent of a man who'd spent 3 hours being diplomatic and wanted badly to stop. He didn't look up when she entered. "Leave the lamps." She set down her oil flask, soft as breath, and began anyway, because lamps unlit meant a king reading by firelight alone, and some habit in her, some old stubborn piece of the girl she'd been before the silence, wouldn't let her leave a task half-finished even for a king who'd told her not to finish it. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything about her now, the way a man notices a draft once he's slept badly enough times to blame it. "I told you to leave them." She lit the third lamp anyway, didn't look at him. Her hands were steady, though her pulse wasn't. A low huff of breath, not quite a laugh, but close to its shadow. "Stubborn," he said, "for a girl who isn't even supposed to have opinions." "I have plenty of opinions," she thought, fierce and sudden. "I simply don't waste them on kings who summon servants like dogs." The thought startled her with its own heat. She hadn't let herself be angry in years. Anger was a luxury that required a voice to spend it with. He rose, crossed to the hearth where she knelt arranging kindling, and crouched. Actually crouched, brought his whole considerable height down to her level, which no one in this palace did, not for a servant, not ever, and reached past her to add a log himself, his forearm close enough to hers that she felt the heat radiating off him like a second fire. "You're not afraid of me," he said, quiet, almost wondering. "Everyone in this house is afraid of me. You flinch at my voice, but you don't flinch at me. There's a difference." She kept her eyes on the kindling. Her heart was doing something complicated and dangerous, something that felt dangerously close to being seen. "I had a wolf once," he went on, and his voice had dropped into a different register now, lower, rougher, the voice she imagined he used for no one, who looked at me exactly like that, like she could smell every lie I'd ever told and didn't think less of me for it. Just catalogued it, filed it away. A pause, and something in his scent shifted, grief gone old and worn smooth like river stone. "She's been dead 9 years. You smell nothing like her. And yet." Mira's breath caught. She turned her head, couldn't help it. The small, involuntary motion of someone reaching toward warmth without deciding to, and found him closer than she'd braced for, his amber eyes lit gold by the new fire, his jaw close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble he hadn't shaved off after the long council day. Neither of them moved. The fire cracked. Somewhere below, 3 floors down, the border lords laughed at something, a roar of sound that didn't touch this room at all. His gaze dropped to her mouth. She thought, wild and certain. He's going to ask me to sing again. Right now. Right here. And I am going to say yes. A fist hammered the door. "Majesty, the Velkos delegation, they're asking after you, sir. Urgent." Rowan closed his eyes for 1 full second, like a man absorbing a blow he'd known was coming, and the moment didn't break so much as it was taken from them, pried loose by duty's rude hand. He stood, straightened his collar. By the time he reached the door, his face had gone back to stone. King's stone. The face that ran kingdoms and buried wolves and never once let anyone see the crack underneath. "Finish the lamps," he said, not unkindly but distant now, already half a king again instead of a man crouched by a fire. "Then go." He left. Mira knelt there a long moment with her hands in her lap, the fire warm on her face, and thought she had never in 4 years of silence wanted so badly to break it. She did not sing again, not on purpose, not for 3 more weeks, but the king found other reasons to send for her. A dropped book that needed retrieving from beneath his bed, a task any servant could have done. Except he waited in the doorway while she did it, and watched her with an attention that made her skin feel too thin for her body. A request, relayed through Pell, who relayed it with his usual flat indifference, that the small mute girl be the one to deliver his morning tray. She's quiet, doesn't clatter the dishes, though Mira suspected quiet had very little to do with it. She began, despite every instinct honed over 4 hard years, to want the summons. She hated herself a little for it. Wanting was a luxury she'd buried alongside her voice, back when wanting things, her sister's safety, her mother's lullabies, a life that wasn't measured in coin and ownership papers, had only ever led to losing them faster. But some nights now, lying in the dark listening to the king pace on the other side of the wall, she let herself imagine what it would feel like to knock, to answer his pacing with her own, to say, simply, "I'm here. I hear you. You're not alone in this house full of people who fear you." She never knocked. But one night, 2 weeks into this strange, undeclared courtship of small errands and longer silences, she hummed again. Soft, low, just for herself, just because the lullaby had crawled up out of some buried place in her chest, and she was too tired to fight it down. The pacing on the other side of the wall stopped instantly. She froze, mid-breath, the melody dying in her throat. A long silence. Then, muffled through stone, so quiet she might have imagined it if her whole body weren't strung tight as a bowstring listening for it. Don't stop. 2 words, not a command this time. Something closer to a plea, though a king like Rowan Vaythorn would never call it that himself. She lay there in the dark with her hand pressed to her own collarbone, feeling her pulse hammer beneath her palm, and made a choice she would spend the rest of the story unmaking and remaking over and over, in small, cowardly increments, and one enormous brave one. She sang, quietly. Just the lullaby, just 3 verses, her voice rusty with disuse but true underneath the rust, the way a blade stays sharp even buried in scabbard for years. On the other side of the wall, utter silence. The listening kind, the kind that has stopped breathing so it won't miss a single note. When she finished, the silence held a long moment. Then, so soft, she almost didn't catch it. "Thank you." She didn't answer. Couldn't. Not in words. Not yet. But she pressed her palm flat against the cool stone of the shared wall, an answer of a different kind. And on the other side, she would have sworn to it, though she'd never know for certain. She felt the faint, answering pressure of his hand doing the same. It was Halvet, the old maidservant who oversaw the linens and who had the singular distinction in that household of having served 3 different rulers across 40 years, and outlived every scandal each of them generated, who first said the thing aloud that everyone else only thought. "He's courting her," Halvet said to Pell one morning, over the household ledgers, in the particular tone of a woman who had seen this exact pattern play out before and found it tiresome rather than scandalous. "The mute girl. Mark me. A king doesn't request the same servant by name 11 times in a month for no reason at all." Pell didn't look up from his count. "She's a servant, Halvet. He's the king." And his father was a stable boy's son 3 generations back before some long-dead alpha decided bloodline mattered more than bond truth, Halvet said, unbothered. "Don't lecture me on what kings can't do. I've buried 2 of them. Bond magic doesn't check the household ledgers before it decides who belongs to whom." Pell's pen stilled. "Bond magic," he repeated, flat. "You haven't smelled it on him? When she's near?" Halvet's eyes, pale and sharp despite her age, fixed on him with something like pity for his nose. "Pell, The man's wolf has been singing under his skin for a month. I'd wager my pension he doesn't even know it yet. Men like him never do, not until the bond's halfway to setting and there's no graceful way out of it left. Pell set down his pen, looked for the first time in longer than he could remember, faintly unsettled by his own ledger. He thought of the girl he'd bought 4 years ago for a flat sum and a signature. Wrists raw, eyes hollow, silent as a held breath, and felt something uncomfortable shift in his chest. Not guilt. He didn't trade in guilt, but something adjacent to it. A miscount he hadn't known he'd made. What did I actually buy? He thought. And what do I actually owe her, now that the bill's about to come due? The wound that forced them together, the engine the whole story would turn on, came 3 nights later, and it came from outside the palace walls entirely, which was its own kind of cruelty. That the thing that finally pressed them into each other's care wasn't fate's gentle hand, but a rival pack's knife. A border lord named Castellan Voss, golden-haired, golden-tongued, a smile that never once reached the cold calculation of his eyes, had come courting Vathorn's alliance under the guise of trade talks. And on the 3rd night of his visit, his honor guard's accidental skirmish with Vathorn's border patrol turned into something less accidental and considerably bloodier. Rowan rode out himself, because a king who sent others to bleed in his place while he stayed warm in his palace was no king. His father had raised him to respect, whatever else that man had broken in him. He came back at dawn with a gash along his ribs that his wolf's healing hadn't yet closed, and a fury banked so low and so cold that the entire household gave him a wide berth. Everyone, that is, except Mira, who happened to be the one carrying clean linens past his chamber door, when Halvet, harried and stretched thin, managing 3 other crises, simply thrust a basin and a roll of bandages into her arms and said, "He won't let the physician near him. Won't let anyone near him. Try. You're quiet. Quiet's all that man can stand right now." So Mira went in, alone, to a king bleeding and furious, and stripped to the waist by his own impatient, blood-slicked hands, and found him exactly as advertised, a wounded animal who had snapped at 3 separate attendants already and meant to snap at a 4th. He didn't snap at her. He watched her cross the room, wary the way a wolf watches anything moving near an open wound, and something in his shoulders eased, fractionally, when he caught her scent. "You," he said. Rough, exhausted. "Of course it's you." She knelt beside him without asking permission, because asking required words she wasn't ready to spend, and began cleaning the wound with hands that had gone steady the moment there was a task to anchor them. He watched her work in silence for a long while, his breath uneven with pain he refused to voice, and she read the whole of it in his scent before his face ever gave it away. Pain first, sharp and copper bright, and under it something rawer, something that smelled like a man who had ridden toward death tonight and hadn't entirely minded the idea of meeting it. That frightened her more than the wound did. She pressed the cloth firmer than necessary against his ribs, not cruel, just present, just here. Stay here. And he flinched, and something in his face cracked open. "You think I went out there carelessly," he said. Not a question. "You're not wrong." She looked up at him, and didn't shake her head this time, didn't give him the practiced lie of incomprehension. She simply held his gaze, steady, and let him see that she understood exactly what he'd confessed. His jaw worked. "My father," he said after a long moment, "ruled this kingdom by being unkillable. Never showed weakness, never showed grief. Buried 2 wives and called it weakness to mourn them past a fortnight." A short, humorless breath. "I've spent 11 years trying not to be him. Some nights I forget why that matters, when the only thing left feels like duty wearing my father's face." She bandaged his ribs in silence, But her hands had gone slower now, gentler, and when she finished, she didn't pull away immediately. She let her palm rest, just a moment, flat against the unbandaged skin above his heart. Not seduction, not even comfort exactly, just proof. The same proof she'd offered through the wall weeks ago. I'm here. You're not alone in this house. His hand came up and covered hers there. Didn't move it, just held it, his much larger palm swallowing hers entirely, his pulse thudding hard and fast beneath both their hands. Say something, he said, very low. Anything. I don't care what. I just want to hear you decide to. Mira's throat worked. 4 years of silence sat heavy and familiar in her chest. The wall she'd built brick by brick to survive a world that had tried to take everything else from her. She opened her mouth, and the door slammed open, and Pell strode in with the physician at his heels, breathless, furious at having been kept out so long, and the moment shattered into ordinary urgent noise. Let me see the wound, Majesty. You should have let us in immediately. And Mira slipped back into the room's shadows, basin in hand, silence reclaimed like a coat pulled tight against cold. But Rowan's eyes followed her the whole time, dark and wanting, and she carried the shape of his hand over hers all the way back down 3 flights of stairs. In the days that followed, the household began to talk, quietly, the way servants always talked, in glances traded over laundry baskets and half-finished sentences swallowed when footsteps approached. Mira heard none of it directly, because no one spoke gossip to her, the silent girl. But she read it anyway, the way she'd learned to read everything. In the new wariness some of the kitchen girls held around her, in the extra care Halvet took to seat her near the fire at meals, in the particular pointed way Castellan Voss's eyes followed her now whenever the border lord lingered in the king's wing under some increasingly thin pretense of ongoing trade talks. It was Voss who first cornered her, 3 days after the king's wound had closed, in the narrow servants' passage between the kitchen and the wine cellar, his golden smile pinned in place like something nailed there, rather than felt. The little mute, he said, blocking her path with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once in his life been told no and believed it. I hear you've caught our king's eye. Strange thing that. A man like Rowan, who could have any wolf-blooded daughter of any noble house in 3 kingdoms, sniffing after a servant who can't even tell him no. His head tilted, considering her with the cool, cataloging eyes of a predator assessing whether prey was worth the chase. Or can you? Tell him no, I mean. I wonder if that's the appeal, a woman who can't argue back. Mira's whole body went cold, then hot, fury rising so fast and sharp she nearly forgot 4 years of practiced silence in one single breath. She didn't speak, but she looked at him, full in the face, no lowered eyes, no servile flinch, and let every ounce of contempt she felt show plainly there, and watched with grim satisfaction as it landed. Voss's smile thinned at the edges. No matter, he said, recovering smoothly, stepping closer, close enough that his cologne, something cloying, expensive, deliberately strong, the scent of a man who didn't trust his own natural smell to impress anyone, overwhelmed the passage. Kings tire of curiosities. When he does, perhaps I'll find a use for you myself. I do enjoy things that can't talk back. His hand closed around her wrist. She didn't think. She drove the heel of her free palm hard into his sternum, shoved him back a full step with strength that surprised them both, and was already moving past him toward the kitchen stairs when a low, terrible growl rolled down the passage from somewhere behind them both. Not human, barely even wolf, something older and far more dangerous. The sound of an alpha's control fraying clean through. Rowan stood at the passage's far end, and the look on his face was one Mira had never seen there before. Not the careful, governed fury of a king managing a diplomatic insult, but something raw and possessive and entirely uncontained. His eyes gone full gold black with the wolf surging close beneath his skin. Voss. One word. It cracked through the passage like a whip. Voss straightened his coat, smile sliding back into place though his scent had gone sharp and sour with fear underneath it. Majesty. Merely greeting your staff. Get out of my wing. Rowan's voice had dropped to something barely above a growl. Get out of my palace. Your trade talks concluded an hour ago, whether you noticed it or not. Voss's eyes flicked once, calculating between the king and Mira, and something ugly and knowing crossed his face. Interesting, he murmured. How quickly a man's hospitality runs out over a servant. He bowed, shallow and mocking, and left without hurrying, the particular insolence of a man who knew he'd planted something and didn't need to wait around to watch it grow. The passage went silent. Rowan crossed it in 4 strides and stopped in front of Mira, his hands hovering near her shoulders like he wanted to check her for damage and didn't trust himself to touch her gently enough to do it. His scent had gone wild. Fury and fear, and something fierce and protective, all tangled together. The smell of a wolf who'd nearly lost something he hadn't yet admitted he owned. Did he hurt you? She shook her head, and meant it this time. Her wrist ached, but Voss's grip had been more arrogance than violence. Rowan's jaw worked. His eyes searched her face like he was looking for a wound he'd missed. I should have had him removed the day he arrived. I knew what kind of man he was the moment he smiled at the serving girls like they were a menu. She almost smiled at that, despite everything, and something in his face eased seeing it. You fought him off yourself, he said, quieter now, something like awe threading under the anger. Before I even got here. She nodded. Good. His hand finally landed, gentle despite the size of it, against her uninjured shoulder. Good. I like that you don't need saving, Mira. He stopped, started again, rougher. I still wanted to be the one who got here in time. The use of her name, again. Soft this time instead of demanding. Did something dangerous to her chest. She did not speak, but she let herself lean, very slightly, into the warmth of his palm, and felt his breath catch at the small permission of it, and thought, with a clarity that frightened her more than Voss's hand on her wrist ever could. I am no longer simply hiding in this silence. I am hiding from something I want. That night the king did not pace. Mira lay in the dark listening for it anyway, out of habit now more than anything, and when the wall stayed quiet for the first time in weeks, she found herself oddly bereft, as though a small, private conversation she hadn't realized she depended on had simply stopped without warning. She rose before dawn, restless, and found her feet carrying her up the servants' stair before her mind had fully agreed to the journey. She told herself she only meant to check the hearth in the king's library, an ordinary task, nothing more. She found him there already, asleep. Actually asleep for once, slumped sideways in the same window seat where he'd told her about his dead wolf weeks ago, a half-finished letter still clutched loosely in one hand. The candle beside him burned down to a guttering stub. She should have left. Instead, she crossed the room quiet as breath and eased the letter from his slack fingers before the dripping wax could ruin it, and in doing so caught sight of the words written there in his own hand, unfinished, addressed to no one she recognized. And if I am wrong about this, if I have simply lost my mind to grief and loneliness, and built a whole woman's heart out of 3 notes through a wall, then tell me now, before I... The letter ended there, mid-thought, mid-confession, as though sleep had simply stolen the rest of it from him before he could decide whether to finish. Mira's hands trembled. She set the letter down on the small table beside him, careful, reverent, and looked at his sleeping face. Slack now, unguarded in a way it never was waking. The hard lines around his mouth softened. One hand still curled loose in the air where the letter had been, reaching for something even in sleep. She thought, he's been writing to someone about me, trying to decide if I'm real. She thought, I have spent 4 years making myself unreal on purpose, and now the one person whose attention I cannot survive losing is the one person asking me to prove I'm not a ghost. She banked the fire, blew out the dying candle, and left him sleeping there, his hand still curled around the absence of the letter she'd taken from him, and she carried the shape of his unfinished sentence with her the rest of that long, sleepless day, turning it over and over like a stone worn smooth by water, trying to decide what it would cost her to finish it for him. The reversal, when it came, did not come from the king at all. It came from a trader passing through the lower town 3 weeks later, a man Pell dealt with regularly for household linens and spices, who mentioned, idly, over the settling of an invoice, with no idea what weight his words carried, that he'd recently done business 2 kingdoms south, in a border province called Ashvale, where a wealthy merchant family had been quietly searching for years for a daughter sold off in a desperate winter. A girl with a singing voice the whole village used to gather to hear before the famine years turned generosity into survival, and survival into selling what you could no longer feed. Strange story, the trader said, counting his coin. The mother never stopped looking, hired men to ask in every market town from here to the coast. Girl would be, 22 now? 23? He shrugged, uninterested in his own anecdote, already moving on to the next line of his ledger. Suppose she's dead by now, most likely. 4 years is a long time for a girl sold that young to survive anywhere. Pell went very still over his own count. He thought of a girl with raw wrists and hollow eyes, bought 4 years ago for a flat sum, silent as held breath, who hummed 3 notes through a wall and undid a king's whole carefully governed heart. He thought, Ashvale, a singer, sold the same winter. He did not say anything to Mira directly. Some instinct, old and careful, told him this wasn't his story to hand to her plainly. Not yet. Not until he understood the shape of it himself. But that evening he watched her across the servants' hall with new eyes, cataloging details he'd filed away as simply hers for 4 years without ever once asking why they were there. The faint old scar along her collarbone that didn't match any injury sustained in his household. The way she still flinched sometimes, at raised male voices, even kind ones, even his own. The particular, careful way she'd negotiated in her very first week, entirely through gesture, that she would never be assigned to serve drink at the household's male staff gatherings. A request so specific, it could only have come from a wound, not a preference. What happened to you, girl? He thought, before I ever counted you among my coin. He didn't ask her outright, but 2 nights later he found her alone in the laundry alcove and set down, without ceremony, a single folded paper on the table beside her. The trader's information, copied out in his own careful hand, the merchant family's name, the province, the year. I don't know if this means anything to you, Pell said, flat as always, betraying nothing of the unease that had sat in his chest for 2 days now. A man mentioned a family searching for a daughter, singer, sold the same winter you came to me. A pause. I thought you should have it. Whatever you choose to do with it is yours to choose. He left without waiting for a reaction, because he understood, in his own quiet, counting way, that some gifts cost more to receive than to give, and a woman deserved to fall apart in private if falling apart was what the gift required. Mira sat alone with the paper a long time before she unfolded it. Her mother's name was written there, in the traitor's careless hand. Selvi Ashgrove. A name she had not heard spoken aloud in 4 years, had not allowed herself to think in 4 years, because thinking it meant remembering the winter the granary failed, and the soldiers came collecting debts the village couldn't pay, and her father offered up the family's only daughter with a singing voice worth coin to a trader passing through. And her mother had screamed his name across the frozen yard until her voice broke, and she had no voice left either, and Mira, 16, terrified, watching her mother's voice die screaming for her, had made a vow in that moment that had shaped every silent year since. If singing is what made me valuable enough to sell, I will never sing for anyone again. I will be worth nothing to anyone who wants to take me. I will be silence itself, and silence cannot be sold. She had kept that vow for 4 years. She had kept it until a king heard 3 stray notes through a wall, and looked at her like she was something worth finding rather than something worth selling. Mira pressed the paper to her chest and wept, silently, by old habit, though there was no one left to hide the sound from. For the mother who had never stopped looking, for the girl she'd been before fear made silence feel like the only safe shape left to wear, and for the strange, terrifying possibility that the voice she'd buried to survive might be the very thing that could finally let her live. She did not go to Rowan immediately. The discovery sat in her chest for 4 days, heavy and unfamiliar, while she turned over the question that mattered most. Not should I tell him, but can I survive being known, after spending 4 years making myself unknowable on purpose? It was the jealousy beat that finally forced the question's hand. Not deliberately, not as anyone's plan, but the way these things always arrive, sideways and unbidden. Castellan Voss, despite being ordered from the palace, had lingered in the lower town under the thin pretense of concluding trade arrangements, and on the 5th evening he appeared at the kitchen gate itself, smiling that nailed-on smile, with a small velvet box he pressed into Mira's hands before she could refuse it. A parting gift, he called it, loud enough for the kitchen staff to hear, his eyes glittering with the particular cruelty of a man who knew exactly what kind of fire he was lighting and simply enjoyed watching it catch. Rowan arrived in the kitchen doorway not 30 seconds later, drawn, she would later understand, by the spike of Voss's scent rolling through the household, that particular cloying cologne wolves could track across 3 floors, when the man wearing it meant trouble. He took in the scene in one sweep. Voss too close, the velvet box in Mira's hands, the kitchen staff gone silent and wide-eyed. Something in his face shut like a door. "Get out," he said to Voss, voice gone flat and cold in a way that frightened the room more than any shout could have. Voss left, finally, smile intact, having gotten exactly the reaction he'd come for. Rowan didn't look at Mira with warmth this time. He looked at her with something guarded and hurt, his jaw tight, his scent gone strange and bitter, and she realized with a sinking lurch that he had misread the entire scene. That a king who'd spent 11 years braced for betrayal, who'd buried one wolf already and learned that loving things meant eventually losing them, had looked at a velvet box in her hands and felt the floor of his own careful hope give way beneath him. "Take whatever gifts you like," he said. Low, controlled, devastating precisely because it was so controlled. "It's no business of mine what a servant accepts from a guest." He turned to leave. It was the first time he had truly disappointed her, not through cruelty, but through doubt, through the same old wound that made him brace for loss before he'd even confirmed there was anything to lose. And it was that disappointment, sharper than any fear Voss had ever managed to put in her, that finally cracked her silence wide open. "Rowan," The word came out rough, unused, cracking in the middle like ice giving way. But it came out, full and clear and undeniably hers, the first word she had spoken aloud to another living soul in 4 years. He stopped dead in the doorway. The kitchen staff around them had gone utterly silent, several mouths actually falling open. But Mira didn't look at any of them. She looked only at Rowan's back, at the way his shoulders had gone rigid, at the way he turned, slow, like a man afraid that moving too fast might shatter something he didn't yet understand was real. "I didn't want it," she said. Her voice shook badly, every syllable an act of raw will against 4 years of careful habit. But she pushed through it anyway. "The box. I don't want him. I never wanted him." Rowan crossed the kitchen in 3 strides and stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the gold of his eyes had gone wide and stunned, close enough to smell the disbelief rolling off him in waves. "You can talk," he said. Not a question. Barely even a statement. Just air, forced out of him by something too big for his chest to hold quietly. "I can," she said. Steadier now, the second sentence easier than the first, the way ice cracks faster once the first fissure opens. "I always could." His hand came up, hovering near her face like he needed permission to touch the proof of what he was hearing. "Why?" he started, and stopped, and started again, gentler. "Why hide it? All this time? Why let everyone believe?" "Because singing got my mother's voice taken from her, screaming my name across a frozen yard while my father sold me to pay a debt," Mira said. And the words came faster now, the dam fully broken, 4 years of silence spilling out in a single, unbroken rush. "Because I decided if a voice could be sold, I would never give anyone a voice worth taking. I made myself worthless on purpose. I made myself safe." The kitchen had emptied somehow, staff melting away with the particular tact servants develop for moments too large to witness, leaving only the 2 of them and the low fire and the velvet box still clutched, forgotten, in Mira's white-knuckled hand. Rowan took the box from her gently and set it on the table, out of the way, like clearing space for something more important. "You're not worthless," he said, low and fierce, his hand finally landing against her cheek, thumb tracing the line of her jaw like he was memorizing it now that he had permission. "You were never worthless. You were the bravest thing in this entire palace, and I was too blind with my own grief to see it until you hummed 3 notes through a wall and made me remember what it felt like to want something again." Mira's breath caught. "I'm not her," she said. "Whoever she was, the wolf you lost. I heard you tell the fire about her. I'm not trying to replace—" "I know," he said, immediate, certain. "I know exactly who you are. That's the whole point, Mira. I'm not looking at you and seeing a replacement for anything. I'm looking at you and seeing—" He stopped, pressed his forehead, briefly, against hers, breathing her in like a man finally allowed to stop holding his breath. "I'm seeing the first thing in 11 years that's made we want to be something other than my father's careful, unfeeling shadow." The breathing space that followed was brief and necessary, and the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has finally broken rather than before one gathers. They stood there in the emptied kitchen a long while, his forehead against hers, her hands finally resting flat against his chest, feeling his heart hammer beneath her palms the way hers hammered under his. "Say my name again," he murmured. "Rowan," she said, and felt him shudder, just slightly, at the sound of it. Again. "Rowan," softer this time. Almost a laugh threading underneath it, 4 years of disuse making her voice crack and waver, but real, undeniably real. "You're going to make me say it until it stops meaning anything." "It will never stop meaning anything," he said, against her hair. "Not from you." But even storms that break still leave wreckage to walk through, and the wreckage here had a name, and that name was about to become a problem far larger than a king's private kitchen confession could fix. The problem arrived 3 days later, in the form of Castellan Voss's parting gift to the household. Not the velvet box, which Mira had returned unopened, but something far more dangerous. A letter sent not to Rowan, but to the wider council of border lords, informing them, with poisonous false delicacy, that Vathorn's Alpha King had taken up with a common servant girl of unknown and possibly compromised origins, a girl bought as property from a southern trader. No pack lineage, no noble blood, no bond claim that any wolf court would recognize as legitimate. And worse, a girl who had deceived the entire household for 4 years about something as fundamental as her own voice. If he can be deceived in his own house, the letter read, in the part Pell intercepted and brought, grim-faced, to Rowan's private council the next morning, what trust can the border lords place in a king so easily misled by his own heart? It wasn't an accusation of treason, not quite. It was something more insidious, a question about judgment, about fitness to rule, dressed up as concern, designed to bleed slowly through every border alliance Rowan had spent 11 years building. Rowan read it once, standing in his council chamber with his closest advisors arrayed uneasy around him, and his face went very still in the particular way Mira had learned, in their short weeks of closeness, meant he was holding something enormous behind a very thin door. "Majesty," said his oldest councilman, a gray wolf named Tassin, who had served Rowan's father before him, and chose his words with the care of a man diffusing something live. "The border lords will ask, formally, within the week, whether you intend to bond with this girl, or whether this is merely," he hesitated, "a passing intimacy. They will ask because Voss has made it impossible for them not to, and whatever you answer will be heard across 3 kingdoms." Rowan set the letter down. "And if I say it's none of their business who I choose to love? Then they will say a king who won't answer for his heart can't be trusted to answer for his crown," Tassin said, not unkindly, simply honest. "You know this, Majesty. You were raised knowing this." The room held its breath. Rowan thought of his father, unkillable, never weak, never grieving past a fortnight, and thought of the letter he'd never finished writing weeks ago, the one Mira had taken gently from his sleeping hand, the one that asked some unnamed correspondent whether he'd simply lost his mind to grief and loneliness, building a whole woman's heart out of 3 notes through a wall. He had not lost his mind. He understood that now with a clarity that steadied something in his chest that had been unsteady for 11 years. "Then let them ask formally," he said, finally, quiet but absolutely certain. "And I'll answer formally, in front of all of them." Tassin's eyebrows rose, just slightly. "Majesty, that's my decision," Rowan said, and for the first time in this entire council, his voice carried the particular finality his father's used to carry, except where his father's finality had always smelled of fear dressed up as strength. Rowan smelled, Tassin would later say to anyone who'd listen, of nothing but certainty. Mira learned of the letter from Halvet, who delivered the news with her usual blunt economy, while folding linens at a pace that suggested she found the whole crisis mildly inconveniencing to her schedule rather than catastrophic. "Voss wrote to the border lords," Halvet said, "called you common, said the king's judgment can't be trusted if he's bonding with bought property instead of pack-blooded nobility." A pause, sharp eyes flicking up. "He's not entirely wrong about the politics of it, mind. Just entirely wrong about you." Mira's hands had gone cold around the sheet she was folding. "Bonding," she repeated. The word landed strange and enormous in her mouth, a thing she hadn't let herself think directly even in the privacy of her own skull. He said bonding? The council will ask him outright, Halvet said, whether his intentions toward you are a true mate bond or merely— She made a small, dismissive gesture. Indulgence. And he'll have to answer in front of every border lord who matters, because Voss has made it a matter of state now instead of a matter of the heart. Mira sat down hard on the laundry bench, the folded sheet sliding, forgotten, from her lap. She had spent 4 years making herself small enough to survive. She had spent the last month, since the night he heard her hum through a wall, slowly, terrifyingly, letting herself become visible again. First her voice, then her history, then, just 3 days ago, her hands flat against his chest in an emptied kitchen, finally letting someone see all of her. But visible in a kitchen, witnessed only by a king and a few startled cooks, was a different country entirely from visible in front of a council of border lords who would weigh her worth in pack blood and noble lineage and find her wanting by every measure they knew how to count. He bought me, she thought, the old fear rising fast and cold. That's how this story starts in their telling. A bought girl. Property. Whatever he feels for me, in their eyes I will always be the coin Pell counted out 4 years ago. Not a woman with a name and a mother who never stopped looking. She thought of Voss's smile, nailed in place, and his velvet box, and his certainty that a king's affection for a woman who couldn't argue back was only ever temporary indulgence, never permanence. She thought, with a despair sharper than any she'd felt in 4 years, what if he believes that too, underneath the kindness? What if, faced with his whole kingdom's judgment, he chooses the crown his father trained him to protect over a servant girl, with no lineage worth defending? She avoided him for 2 days, not out of anger. She understood, with painful clarity, that this crisis wasn't his making, that he hadn't asked for Voss's cruelty or the council's scrutiny, but out of a fear too old and too deep to argue away with logic. The fear that said, love things enough and the world finds a way to make you pay for it. Better to step back now, on your own terms, than to be cast aside later on someone else's. Rowan noticed, of course. A king who'd spent weeks learning to track her scent through 3 floors of stone noticed instantly when that scent began deliberately avoiding him. And on the second evening, he found her in the small palace chapel, the one place in Vaythorn that even kings were expected to enter unarmed and unannounced. She knelt near the cold hearth at the chapel's edge, not praying exactly, just sitting with her own tangled thoughts, when his footsteps, careful, deliberately slow, the footsteps of a man trying not to spook something wary, stopped a respectful distance behind her. "You've been avoiding me," he said, not accusing, just stating the wound plainly, the way he seemed to have learned somewhere in these past weeks. That plain honesty cost less between them than careful diplomacy. "Yes," Mira said. Her voice still felt strange in her own mouth, new and raw, but it came easier now, each use wearing the rust away a little further. "Why?" She turned to face him. In the low light, his face looked tired, the particular tiredness of a man who'd spent 2 days fielding council pressure and missing her at the same time, and some old protective instinct in her ached at the sight of it even through her own fear. "Because you bought me," she said, finally. The words she'd been circling for 2 days landing flat and bare between them. "Not you, Pell, but it doesn't matter, does it? To the border lords? I am property with a price attached, and you are a king whose whole crown rests on bloodlines and bond legitimacy, and I watched you in that council chamber decide to fight for me in front of men who will never, ever stop seeing me as the coin that bought me." Her breath shook. "I have spent my whole life being something men decided the value of without asking me. I won't survive being that again. Not even for you." Rowan was quiet a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice had gone low and rough in a way she hadn't heard from him before. Not the controlled rasp of a king managing his temper, but something closer to the unguarded voice he'd used asleep in the window seat. Half-finished letter curled in his slack hand. "My father," he said, "told me, the week before he died, that love was a debt collector's eventually called in, and the wise king never borrowed more than he could afford to lose." He looked at his own hands, turning them over like he was examining old scars there. "I believed him for 11 years. I buried one wolf and decided the lesson was never owe anyone your heart again, because eventually the debt comes due and you pay it in grief. That's why I never remarried, never let any noble daughter close enough to matter. I thought distance was strength." He looked up, eyes finding hers, steady and stripped bare of every careful kingly distance he usually wore. "Then I heard 3 notes through a wall," he said, "and some buried, unkillable part of me that had nothing to do with politics or pack blood or my father's careful arithmetic simply recognized you. Not your price, not your papers. You." His jaw worked. "I'm not asking the council to approve a transaction, Mira. I'm telling them I've found my mate bond, and I don't care what column of their ledger she comes from." Mira's breath caught hard. "You don't know that," she whispered. "The bond. You can't know that just from—" "I know it the way every wolf in this kingdom knows their bond," he said, quiet and certain. "Scent deep. Bone deep. I knew it the night you hummed and my whole chest went tight like something finally clicking into a lock it had been searching for 11 years." He closed the distance between them, slow, giving her every chance to step back, and didn't touch her. Just stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, could read in his scent. Steady now. None of the old grief bitterness, just want, plain and unguarded, exactly how true every word had been. "Tell me to walk away, and I will. I won't force this on you. You've had enough of your worth decided by other people. I won't be one more man doing that to you." Mira stood there, caught between 4 years of careful self-protection and this single, enormous, terrifying offer of being chosen. Not despite her price tag, not in spite of her silence, but because of who she'd had to become to survive both. "I'm afraid," she admitted, the words costing her everything she had left. "Not of you. Of all of it. Of being seen by people who will only ever count my worth in blood and lineage, and decide I come up short." "Then let me be afraid with you," Rowan said. "I'm not offering you safety from fear, Mira. I'm offering you a hand to hold while we walk through it anyway." The council convened 3 days later in the Great Hall, border lords arrayed on both sides, Castellan Voss seated near the front with his nailed-on smile already in place, anticipating victory. Mira stood at the hall's edge in a plain gray dress. No finery. No attempt to dress herself into something the lords might find more palatable. Because some fierce, newly recovered part of her had decided she would not perform nobility. She didn't have to win a war that should never have required performance at all. Rowan sat his throne with his spine straight and his face unreadable. And when Tassin rose to formally pose the council's question, "Does His Majesty intend a true mate bond with the servant Mira, of unknown lineage, formerly held as property of this household?" The entire hall went still enough to hear the great hearth fire crackling at its edges. Rowan rose. "I do," he said. 2 words, plain, carrying farther in their simplicity than any speech could have. "And I'd remind this council that my own grandmother was a fisherman's daughter with no pack blood worth counting, until my grandfather bonded her, and the realm survived the scandal of it for 60 prosperous years afterward." A pause, his eyes sweeping the hall, finding Voss's smile and watching it falter under the weight of his gaze. Lineage builds alliances. It doesn't build loyalty, and it certainly doesn't build love. I have ruled this kingdom for 11 years by my father's careful arithmetic of distance and duty, and I am done pretending that arithmetic ever made me a better king. It only made me a lonelier one. He crossed the hall, in front of every lord, every councilman, every watching eye, and stopped in front of Mira, and took her hand in both of his, not asking permission this time, but offering instead a question with his eyes that asked something far simpler. With me? In front of all of them? Mira's heart hammered. She thought of her mother, screaming her name across a frozen yard, voice breaking on the cold. She thought of 4 years of silence built to keep herself unsellable, unseen, safe. She thought, safety was never actually the goal. Survival was. And I have survived. Now I get to choose what comes after. Yes, she said, clear and steady. Her voice, her own, recovered, hers, carrying the full length of the great hall. With you. The hall erupted into a confusion of murmurs, some scandalized, some, surprisingly, Halvet's voice loudest among them, delighted. But Rowan didn't seem to hear any of it. He lifted Mira's hand to his lips, eyes never leaving hers, and the bond between them, already half-formed in scent and certainty for weeks now, settled the rest of the way into place with a warmth that felt, Mira would later try and fail to describe to Halvet, like a held breath finally let go. Voss left the hall before the session formally closed, his smile finally, fully gone. The quiet, after storms, always arrives strange and almost unbelievable. The body braced for impact long after the danger has passed. That night, Mira found herself once more in the king's chamber, though this time the door stood open by invitation rather than duty, and the basin of water she'd once knelt over in fear sat forgotten and cold on its stand, while she stood instead at the window beside Rowan, both of them simply breathing the same quiet air. "Sing for me," he said. Not a command this time. A request, soft, almost shy in a way she hadn't yet seen from him. She did. Not the lullaby this time, but something new, something she made up on the spot, low and unpolished and entirely hers, a song with no words yet, just melody, just the shape of relief finally let loose after 4 long years of holding it back. Rowan listened with his eyes closed, his hand finding hers without looking, and when she finished, the silence that followed held none of the old fear in it at all. "I used to think," he said, quiet, "that the bond would feel like certainty, like suddenly knowing everything." His thumb traced slow circles against her knuckles. "It doesn't. It feels like this, just wanting to keep hearing you every day for the rest of however many years we get." "That's not very kingly," Mira said, a small smile finally, fully surfacing, the first real one she'd let herself wear in longer than she could remember. "No," he agreed, and pulled her gently into the curve of his arm, resting his chin against her hair, breathing her in like a man finally, completely at peace with what he'd found. "It's better." Outside, the palace settled into its ordinary nighttime sounds, distant laughter from the guards' hall, the creak of the 3rd stair, the wind finding its way through the East Hall's draft, and none of it pressed on either of them the way it once had, because the silence between them now held nothing left to hide. "Rowan," Mira said, testing the shape of his name once more, the way she suspected she'd keep testing it for years, never quite tired of how it felt leaving her mouth freely. I'm not afraid anymore." He pulled back just enough to look at her properly, gold eyes warm in the low firelight, and pressed his lips, soft and unhurried, to her forehead. Not a claim, not a performance for any watching world, just 2 people finally, quietly choosing each other with no one left to convince but themselves. "Good," he murmured against her hair, "because I intend to spend a very long time making sure you never have to be." And in the hush that followed, no audience, no counsel, no ghosts left lingering at the edges, Mira let herself simply lean into him, into the warmth, into the scent of cedar and home, into the voice she had finally, fully chosen to keep, and understood, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable in her chest, that she had not been found that night through a wall so much as she had, after 4 long years, finally found her way back to herself.